must reject the failed approaches of the past and work together to confront some of the greatest threats in history. There is no more serious danger to our planet today than the most powerful and destructive weapons ever devised by man, of which the United States, as you know, has many. Just as I did in my first term, I've made containing these threats a top priority, starting with the nation of Iran. My position is very simple. The world's #1 sponsor of terror can never be allowed to possess the most dangerous weapon. That's why, shortly after taking office, I sent the so-called Supreme Leader a letter making a generous offer. I extended a pledge of full cooperation in exchange for a suspension of Iran's nuclear program. The regime's answer was to continue their constant threats to their neighbors and U.S. interests throughout the region and some great countries that are right nearby. Today, many of Iran's former military commanders, in fact, I can say almost all of them, are no longer with us. They're dead. And 3 months ago, in Operation Midnight Hammer, 7 American B-2 bombers dropped the 14 30,000-pound each bombs on Iran's key nuclear facilities, totally. As everyone knows, I have also been deeply engaged in seeking a ceasefire in Gaza. Have to get that done. Have to get it done. Unfortunately, Hamas has repeatedly rejected reasonable offers to make peace. We can't forget October 7th, can we? Now, as if to encourage continued conflict, some of this body is seeking to unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state. The rewards would be too great for Hamas terrorists for their atrocities. This would be a reward for these horrible atrocities, including October 7th, even while they refuse to release the hostages or accept a ceasefire. Instead of giving to Hamas and giving so much, because they've taken so much, they have taken so much. This could have been solved so long ago. But instead of giving in to Hamas's ransom demands, those who want peace should be united with one message: release the hostages now. Just release the hostages now.
Breaking from the United Nations General Assembly. Donald Trump has just delivered one of the most explosive speeches ever heard inside the UN chamber. A speech filled with warnings, attacks, bold claims, and defiance. And around the world, leaders are asking the same question: what does this mean for America, and for the future of global politics? Trump entered the hall of the United Nations with every camera fixed on him, every diplomat leaning forward. His return to this global stage was not a moment of reconciliation, but a moment of confrontation. Instead of speaking like a statesman weaving together consensus, he spoke like a fighter, declaring war on the very foundations of globalization, migration, and climate policy. And for nearly an hour, he held the assembly captive. The first strike came against immigration. Trump thundered that uncontrolled migration was not just a challenge, but an existential threat. He told leaders bluntly that their countries were going to hell if they allowed open borders. His words rang through the hall like a hammer. He accused the United Nations of fueling the very crisis by funding programs that give food, shelter, and debit cards to migrants on their journeys. He mocked European leaders for sacrificing their heritage, and he warned America's allies that unless they closed their borders, their nations would collapse under the weight of migration. This was not diplomacy. This was a warning shot. Then Trump turned his sights on climate change. Where most world leaders describe climate change as humanity's greatest danger, Trump called it the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world. He laughed at the idea of renewable energy, mocking wind and solar as expensive fantasies that do not work. He said green energy was destroying economies, raising prices, and handing power to countries that cheat. He insisted the only way to keep nations strong was to embrace fossil fuels. Oil, gas, coal, not solar and wind, were the foundations of greatness. It was a direct rejection of decades of international climate agreements, and a clear statement that America, under Trump, would once again walk away from global environmental commitments. From there, Trump attacked the United Nations itself. With open disdain, he asked, "What is the purpose of the United Nations?" He accused the institution of wasting money, fueling mass migration, and failing to stop wars. He mocked its bureaucracy, its speeches, even its building renovations. At one point, he complained about the UN's escalator not working and the teleprompter failing, turning these moments into metaphors for what he called UN incompetence. Yet, despite this, he claimed America was still 100% behind the United Nations, but only if it reformed, only if it stopped what he called empty words and hypocrisy. On foreign policy, Trump's tone was no less confrontational. He praised Ukraine's resistance against Russia, but accused Europe of hypocrisy for continuing to buy Russian energy. He said European nations were devastating themselves with both immigration and dependence on hostile powers. He warned that recognizing Palestine as a state would reward terrorism, and he demanded the release of hostages taken by Hamas. He boasted that during his presidency he had ended 7 unendable wars, casting himself as the only leader strong enough to bring peace through strength. He even floated the idea of using artificial intelligence to monitor biological weapons, a vague proposal that raised eyebrows but fit his pattern of dramatic claims. The speech also veered into self-praise. Trump reminded the assembly of his own achievements, claiming food and grocery prices had fallen under his leadership. He said he had been unfairly denied a Nobel Peace Prize. He spoke of his unique ability to stop wars and bring prosperity. These moments felt less like a UN address and more like a campaign rally, designed to show his base that he was standing up to the global elite. His rhetoric throughout the speech was classic Trump, polarizing, alarmist, and theatrical. He framed every issue in stark terms: us versus them, nations that protect their borders versus nations that collapse, leaders who tell the truth versus elites who spread lies. His words were filled with repetition, hammering home the same themes: immigration, climate, sovereignty, until they stuck in the minds of listeners. His tone was not that of compromise, but of confrontation. Critics immediately pointed out the exaggerations and falsehoods. Climate experts noted that renewable energy is now cheaper than fossil fuels in much of the world. Diplomats rejected the claim that the UN is paying for migrants to invade the West. Historians reminded audiences that Trump had not ended 7 wars, but merely shifted U.S. presence or claimed credit for diplomatic pauses. And yet, none of that mattered for the power of the performance. The point of the speech was not detail. The point was dominance. The consequences of this moment are profound. For allies in Europe, Trump's words were an insult, accusing them of weakness and hypocrisy. For the United Nations, his words were a blow to its credibility, undermining the very idea of multilateral cooperation. For America, the speech was a statement: under Trump, America first would always outweigh international agreements. And for his supporters back home, it was proof that he was unafraid, unfiltered, and unwilling to bend. This was a speech designed to divide, to polarize, to provoke, and in that sense, it succeeded. Supporters called it a courageous defense of sovereignty and truth. Critics called it reckless, misleading, and dangerous. But everyone agreed on one thing: it was unforgettable. Donald Trump has once again proven that he sees the world stage not as a place for diplomacy, but as a place for battle. And his battle is against globalism, against climate policy, against open borders, and against the very institution that invited him to speak. What remains to be seen is how the world will respond. Will nations rally against his vision? Or will some quietly find themselves pulled toward it? One thing is certain: Trump's UN speech has already changed the conversation. It has reignited debates about immigration, energy, sovereignty, and the future of global cooperation. And as the shockwaves ripple outward, the world will have to decide: is Trump's vision a warning to ignore, or a prophecy of the future?